Welcome to Leading the Way at Leonards, and I'm your host, Dwayne Knepper. Today, we'll be talking about some of the trucking industry's greatest challenges and opportunities. As always, riding shotgun with me is Leonards Express CEO, Ken Johnson.
Thanks, Dwayne. Today, we are fortunate to have a guest who knows as much about the trucking industry as anyone. I'd like to introduce my longtime friend and president of the Trucking Association of New York, Kendra Hems.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ken.
Great to see you.
Good seeing you.
Oh, was that my cue? I'm sorry. Kendra, can you tell us about the Trucking Association of New York? How does TANY help its members come together and communicate and learn?
Sure, absolutely. So we are a trade association, so we're membership based. We represent the trucking industry here in New York State, but we also work very closely with our partners at the federal level with the American Trucking Associations. Honestly, I'd say one of the biggest benefits you have from membership is information. So we know within the trucking industry, there's so many rules and regulations and compliance issues. And we have experts here on staff that can assist our members with any questions they have, whether it be issues that they run into on roadside, if it's record keeping, right down to tax issues, human resources concerns, anything that might come up over the course of your day-to-day business. We have experts here that can ensure you're getting the correct answers. We work very closely with our partners at various state agencies that regulate the industry. So we have that direct resource to be able to get answers if we don't have them here internally. So information through compliance assistant, educational seminars is really one of the biggest benefits. And then in addition to that, one of the areas that Ken and I work on very closely is all of our advocacy work. And advocacy is a little tricky from a membership perspective because anything we do in terms of legislation or regulation can affect anyone, whether you're a member or not. But what I say is if you're not a member of the association, then your voice isn't necessarily the one that's getting heard. Because our members are who drive our legislative agenda. So if you have issues that you feel need to be addressed from either a legislative standpoint or a regulatory standpoint, that's where your membership benefit comes into play because you can participate in our government affairs committee and make sure that we're adding those issues to our legislative agenda.
Right.
Wow, Kendra, that's awesome. TANY does a tremendous job of recognizing organizations that demonstrate leadership and excellence. The Fleet Safety Award is one of many examples. This year, Leonards Express won TANY's Fleet Safety Award's Grand Trophy, the highest honor given to a member fleet that has demonstrated a commitment to safe operation in New York State. Why did TANY select Leonards Express for this prestigious award?
Leonard's has a long history of being a safe operator and just kind of on the cutting edge of everything. So not only do they have an amazing culture as it relates to safety, but they're always looking at how they improve, whether it's training or the use of technology. Their performance is always improving in terms of we look at accident rates, we look at OSHA compliance, workers' compensation. And Leonard's just has that trend that shows us that they're continually working at improving their program. So it was I will say it's tough. Our members, many of them go above and beyond. So when you win Grand Trophy or the Grand Champion, it is really a prestigious award because you're going up against some of the best carriers that we have in the state. So Leonard's just stood out this year based on the information they provided us, what we know of their company, their history, their dedication to safety. It was well deserved.
Well, thank you. And, certainly from my perspective, it's an award I'm very proud of, a couple of reasons. One, I know how hard our people have worked, over the last several years to, improve our safety. We're always working on that and we will continue to work on that. But as Kendra mentioned, it's not an easy award to win. There's a lot of quality fleets, a lot of safe fleets in New York. So, to win that, certainly, says a lot about our people and what we've accomplished. And, we hope to do it again. But I know that the competition is certainly, great. And that's great overall, for New York State. That means, the fleets are all working hard to be safe and, make our roads safe. As far as Leonard's perspective, we've been members of TANY since my dad's prior company, and my dad was quite involved, and we think it's an important for our company to be involved with TANY, and we're a member of several other state organizations, but obviously being based in New York, that's the one we're most active in. And they do a wonderful job representing the industry in both Albany and New York City, and we're going to talk a little bit about that here later on. But they also provide a lot of resources to the fleets. New York is a little bit unique compared to some of the other state trucking associations in that New York is a fairly good sized state with a large population, but from a trucking perspective, there's not a lot of large carriers here. So the representations are more of the smaller fleets, the family-owned fleets, a lot of agricultural fleets, and so every fleet that's in New York should be involved. We always push for that. Not all do get involved, but they all benefit from the work that TANY does, and certainly we're proud to be a member and an active member. I think that's an important piece as well. If you're going to join, get involved. There's a lot of things to get involved with, whether it's obviously I'm partial to the Government Affairs Committee, but they also do a lot of other great things with the safety and maintenance and the truck driving championships and the technician competitions, those types of things. So, but since I mentioned it, let's get into some of the subjects that the Government Affairs Committee and the association is looking at in general. And one of the first things that is in front and center in my mind is tort reform. When you look at all the nuclear verdicts and the talk of that and the cost of insurance and everything's going on, the association feels that we need to start looking at some of the laws that may still protect people, but maybe make it a little fairer for everyone involved in a lawsuit. You want to add to that, Kendra?
Yeah, I think we struggle with this issue in New York because the trial attorneys here are very, very strong, and that's unfortunately who we're often at odds with when we're trying to make changes to address this issue. But over the last 5 to 10 years, this is becoming I think one of the number one threats to our members. As Ken said, in New York, we're primarily small business. It's a lot of multi-generational family-owned companies, and these lawsuits that are happening now across the country are affecting everyone. Even if you're not the subject of the lawsuit, what we're seeing is the impact on insurance rates, and those rates are rising to the point where it's getting harder and harder for smaller carriers to be able to afford the insurance. So even though we haven't necessarily had what they call a nuclear verdict here in New York, our members are still being impacted by this trend. So it is the number one issue for us this year that we're tackling. Essentially, we're trying to figure out how do you start to filter out these meritless lawsuits, keep the awards into a more reasonable level. We're working with, in New York, it's the Lawsuit Reform Alliance of New York, and we're working with them on some legislation. We were pushing legislation this past session that we'll work on again in the coming session that would curb the third-party financing on some of these lawsuits. That's where a big issue is coming from, because that's what's driving these, what they call nuclear verdicts, in some cases, $20 million. I think to put a little bit of context to this, one of the best examples is a story that came out of Arkansas, and I think, Ken, you're familiar with this one. It was a small third-generation company. They were delivering a load. They had an issue with the tractor, so they brokered with another company to come and pick their trailer up and finish the delivery. So here's a situation where the original company gets pulled into a lawsuit, even though the accident occurred with a tractor and a driver that were not their own. Ultimately, what ends up happening is these attorneys use what's called the reptile theory. And if you're not familiar with it, it's basically they try and villainize the defendant. So they try and pull information in that really doesn't have anything to do with the case, but their whole intent is to make the jury dislike the defendant, and that's what helps drive these awards up. In this case, the initial award came back, I think it was $23 million against the carrier, who did not even have a truck or a driver in the accident. And essentially, they held that that carrier should have known better. They should have done their research. They should have known the safety history of the carrier they were brokering out to, and therefore they were accountable. It ultimately put the company out of business. So here's a third generation family owned business. They had about 20 employees and they had to go out of business as a result of something that was not their fault, was not their driver, was not their truck. And yet they got hit with a $23 million award. It ultimately was settled back down to $7.5 million. But between the lawsuit costs and the insurance rates, in addition to the award, they just couldn't justify continuing to fight it and staying in business to put them out of business. So that's what we're fighting against. We're trying to prevent that, number one, from happening in New York. But part of that is getting a handle on the third-party financing. So that's going to be one of our priority issues this year.
Yeah, the third-party financing is, is a big problem. I was having lunch with a friend of mine who happens to be a judge, and we were talking about nothing in particular, but the lawsuits in general. And judges would prefer the parties to mediate or negotiate. And you get with the third-party financing, they have no interest in that. They want to go for the full. Full win, whatever that number is that they have in mind, and make a return off of what they've invested in. The negotiation is not, something they're interested at all in, and they're not in it, for the well-being of any, individual that may have been harmed. They're in it to make money, and that's not what this should be about. It should be about getting people healthy and whole, and not about a third party, making a profit. That's not at all what this is about. So, obviously very important, and it's a big part of what's going on in the industry these days. Both from as Kendra mentioned, putting small fleets out of business, as well as driving insurance rates, through the roof, which make them, unaffordable for a lot of smaller carriers. So. A lot to do there. It's not an easy subject to deal with in Albany, but we're going to take it on and see what we can do. Speaking of not easy subjects, highway use tax. Let's talk about that a little bit. I think my dad was talking about highway use tax 30 years ago, and he was probably second generation of people talking about highway use tax in New York. So this has obviously been a long battle for the industry to try to get rid of a tax. It's New York is one of only 4, maybe 5 states now, I guess, with a highway use tax, and it's unfair to New York-based fleets, and it's easy to evade if you're an out-of-state fleet, which is it makes it even tougher for New York State. So we've been having these conversations, but as we do every year, we'll go after it. So. Kendra can talk a little bit more about the approach and some of the things we're seeing, and just the fact that we may not be getting the tax repeal, but we may find some relief in other areas of the tax.
Yeah, and I have to say, so a little known fact, well, maybe not so little known, but I actually got into this industry because my stepfather's family owned a trucking company. So Ken and I go way back, like well beyond the our involvement here at the association, because our families used to work together back when we had KJ Transportation under Ken's father. And this issue went back that far. So this has been around for a long time. And unfortunately, it's one of those examples in New York that once New York puts something in place that generates revenue to the state, it is really, really difficult, regardless of how much justification you have for it, to repeal it. We have had multiple studies done showing the negative impact that this tax has on our New York State-based carriers, showing the amount of money that the state loses because of evasion. The studies give examples and ways to make up the revenue to the state if they were to eliminate the highway use tax. Even if they didn't raise other taxes or fees, we've seen in other states 30, 40 years ago that repealed this tax, where they saw their IFTA and their IRP receipts increase because they eliminated evasion. So once they got evasion, took care of the evasion issue, they saw those receipts come up. Unfortunately, despite the arguments, nobody wants to lose $100-some-odd million that goes into the dedicated highway and bridge trust fund. So it's just been a very difficult issue for us. So as Ken said, we've transitioned a bit in terms of our strategy. We're looking at ways that we can find some relief from the tax, whether it's administrative, if there's the way that the state handles the returns, even things as simple as like where the decals placed, just as anything that we can do to try and make compliance with the tax easier, we're looking at. And then the other piece of this, and this might segue a bit into one of the other issues we're going to talk about, is some of the environmental things that are coming down the pike and the cost that that's going to raise or create for the industry. So we're tying the highway use tax relief into incentives related to environmental initiatives, because we know the equipment costs more. Even if you want to do some things to kind of bridge the gap between moving toward a zero emission vehicle, it's still going to cost you more money. So if we can convince the state that it makes sense to eliminate this tax and free up some resources for companies to invest in greening their fleet, that's going to be a new strategy that we take on with the legislature this year.
Absolutely. Wow, Kendra, I've seen some of the placement of those HUT stickers. They're so inconsistent. It's another thing. Hey, why can't, if we're going to stick with it, why can't we color coordinate it according to the colors of our fleet? You know what I mean?
Harder for enforcement to see, Dwayne, you know?
Sure. Let's shift gears. Yeah, absolutely. Let's shift gears and talk about New York City's congestion pricing. It's a plan that would impose a fee on cars and commercial vehicles entering Manhattan between the hours of like 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. on weekdays. Kendra, what kind of fees are they talking about for motor carriers?
We don't know yet. It's a huge concern for us. And to be quite honest with you, our position on this has changed a bit since the pandemic. So prior to the pandemic, when congestion pricing was going through the legislative process, our stance was we weren't necessarily opposing congestion pricing. We recognized if it worked the way it was intended, which was to reduce congestion, that there could be benefits to the trucking industry because they're not getting stuck in congestion on the bridges, that it would help reduce their fuel use, their emissions, they'd have better access to parking in the city. What we were looking for, though, were some concessions. So whether it was, a credit against the bridge toll that you were paying, ensuring that trucks were only paying once a day versus every time they go into the zone, parity with passenger vehicles so that we weren't actually paying more than passenger vehicles were. So there were a lot of things that we were looking for to try and mitigate the impact, but we weren't necessarily opposing the plan in and of itself. And to be clear, it would go into effect south of 60th Street in New York City. So anytime you cross over that kind of invisible barrier of 60th Street is when you would pay that toll. We don't know. We haven't heard. They haven't given us any idea of what this would cost for commercial vehicles. We have heard for passengers anywhere from like 15 to 25, even maybe as high as $30, depending on, are you using Easy Pass? What time of day are you crossing into? But all of that has yet to be fleshed out. They just named the panel. It's the Traffic Mobility Review Board is what they're calling it. And it's a panel of individuals that are actually supposed to meet and put the proposal forth of what these tolls will be. Disappointing, but not surprising. There's really no transportation interest on the panel. Just last week, Mayor Adams did name his selection. It is the head of the transport union, but in terms of their, I guess, advocacy for trucking, I'm not so sure it's there. There's like 4 individuals that are either on or at one time were on the MTA board. And most of them represent real estate. So it's not something that looks to be in favor of us as the trucking industry. We're waiting for the full environmental assessment to be released. It's supposed to come out on Wednesday. And once we have an opportunity to review that, then we'll really figure out what our strategy is going to be moving forward in terms of how we push back on this. Truthfully, I think trucks just should be exempt. Coming out of the pandemic, understanding the essential nature that they played, they basically kept New York City running. If New York City didn't have trucks, they would have been completely shut down during the pandemic. And that has to be acknowledged at some point. We've been working hard since the pandemic's been starting to wane, I guess is the best word. And it's just, they keep it seems like it's one thing after another in New York City in terms of the cost and the burden that they continue to put on the trucking industry. So we're planning on pushing back pretty hard on this. They have to understand the essential nature of the trucking industry to New York City. And if the pandemic wasn't enough to show them, I'm not sure what's going to be. So we're going to have to come out pretty loud and pretty hard in terms of pushing back on this. But it's too much.
Yeah, I thought I saw an article that the federal government was intervening in the context of pending what the studies are on that effect of congestion pricing. Again, not sure whose side they were actually on, but
well, I have my opinion on that. They had, so what you might be referring to is back in early June. So there's a process here. So the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the MTA, is who would essentially run the congestion pricing program. They have to do what's called an environmental assessment. They did their initial assessment. They submitted that to the Federal Highway Administration for review. FHWA came back to the city with over 400 questions about the assessment. So initially, it looked like this was really going to get delayed. We weren't thinking we were going to see anything before the end of this year. And then all of a sudden, it comes out at the end of June. Oh, no, we've answered all the questions. So MTA submitted their responses to these 400 questions, and the feds have essentially signed off initially. So it's not yet approved. The MTA has to go through a public hearing process. They've got, I think, 6 hearings. They're all going to be held virtually. There's a comment period through September. Don't quote me on the date. I want to say September 15th. And then once that period is over, the feds review it again and ultimately decide whether or not they're going to approve the city to move forward with congestion pricing. So it's not essentially a done deal. However, given who is currently in the administration, particularly at USDOT, and kind of where we know they stand on environmental issues and social justice issues, we're not anticipating that Federal Highway is going to withhold that approval. We suspect they're going to move forward with it.
Yeah, Leonard is probably not going to be directly impacted by the congestion pricing, but one of the things that one of the reasons I feel it's important that is my involvement with the Government Affairs Committee, on take on this issue is I really see this as a slippery slope that if New York gets this put in place, what's going to stop the next city or even some of the interstates that are a little bit overcrowded, that they're going to build that on the back of the trucking industry, and that will have an impact on our company. And so it's important that we'll probably not going to be able to stop it, but we at least make it fair, so that it's fair to our industry, and and it makes it so that any entity that takes it on in the future has a knows that they're going to get a little bit of pushback and be forced to do it the right way. So moving on from that, TANY recently had a Clean Trucks conference in Buffalo. So Kendra, can you share with us some of the highlights from that, or anything new you learned from that, as well as any other environmental initiatives in New York State?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So this is our second year doing this conference. We just give a little bit of history behind it. What we're finding more and more is that either companies aren't fully aware of what's happening in this world, if you will, and kind of thinking that the idea of zero emission trucks is significantly in the future, when unfortunately they are not. I shouldn't say unfortunately. I think it's what's unfortunate is the way that the state's trying to move them forward.
I got you.
The other thing we're finding is that there's a lot of fear, in terms of what's happening and what it's going to mean for the industry. So our intent with doing this conference was to really just provide information, make sure the industry understood what is coming down the pike, what rules and regulations are out there, what direction is the state and the nation moving in, but also to give them information on what they can do today to kind of green their fleet. That doesn't necessarily mean going into an electric truck. There's a lot of things that can be done today at minimal cost that you shouldn't necessarily be afraid of. And one of the things that we try and express as much as we can to our legislature and the regulators and even the environmental community is, as the trucking industry, we're not the bad guys. Everybody likes to kind of look at us like the big they still look at us as these big black smoke belching trucks, and we're not that anymore. We haven't been for 10, 15, 20 years. There's been such vast improvements made in terms of the emissions that we're not the bad guy. And in fact, the industry is advocating to go green. We just want to make sure it's done in a way that makes sense, that's not going to put additional costs and burden on the industry, and kind of let the market drive that trend. So I think as an industry, we understand the importance of sustainability and taking care of our environment. We just don't want to be put out of business, as we get there. So what the intent of the conference was to provide education. It was to bring different stakeholders together. So we have regulators there, we have the trucking industry there, we have environmental groups that come and present. And it was a way to have conversations, talk through concerns. One of the new things we did this year is we did a fleet roundtable where fleets were really able to give feedback on what the concerns were, what their challenges were as it related to going green. So that we're going to be summarizing the comments that came out of those roundtables and providing some more context and education around that as well going forward. I can't say there's necessarily anything new that came out of the conference that we weren't aware of already, Ken, but I think, again, it's just more that information sharing, kind of seeing where the trends are going. We had some good presentations that showed electric can work in the right environment, primarily urban, small, short, local runs. We're not there yet for even a regional or an over the road. Again, the challenge about the infrastructure build out and the cost of not only the truck, but the total cost of ownership as it relates to the charging. All those things were discussed again. In truth, I think we'll get there. I don't know if it's going to be 100% electric by the time you or I retire, but I think that that's the trend. That's the way the industry is going to go. It's certainly the way the manufacturers are going. The caveat there is whether or not the government can figure out how to do it the right way, and we have a grid that can support that transition. Right now, we don't. We definitely do not. So a lot of it's really going to be dependent on how much the government's willing to do to support that transition going forward.
Ken, one of the things I've had in discussions with drivers. And again, a lot of unanswered questions. A lot of it stems on the infrastructure, but how electric vehicles would impact what's at the core, hours of service for drivers. That was a big thing. Again, we don't know what that is going to look like down the road. But I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ken.
No, I was just going to follow up on some comments. From our perspective, and we do have an upcoming episode with a couple of gentlemen from Leonards that were at the conference and discussing our overall sustainability plan. But my concern is, especially with some of the state initiatives on environmental issues as it relates to the vehicles, is they're looking for a one size fits all, and it doesn't work in our industry. What we do is different than some smaller fleets that maybe stay more local. We cover all the lower 48 states, and there's a lot of states that have different thoughts on this, and they're moving in different directions, and fitting our operation into multiple jurisdictional challenges that are created. So we obviously are looking for opportunities to participate in some of these initiatives. Sometimes, another frustration we have with some of the funding that's available is directed to downstate. There's not a lot of opportunities. The electric vehicles are quite a bit more expensive than diesel. And, some of the funding opportunities out there to equalize those costs are specifically targeted for, some of the downstates, especially the port areas, which kind of take us out of the conversation. So, we're pushing, hopefully we can find a way to, do some of that. We're looking, I think tomorrow we have a pilot test at our warehousing campus with an electric yard horse. That's one way that we can get involved. That works for us. There's a place, we plug it in, when it's not being used. So, so we're excited about that, but also frustrated at some of the one size fit all conversations that is going on at the state. But it's Kendra is doing a great job representing us. She's been on some committees up there and representing the industry. So all we can do is push back and have the conversations where they make sense.
Yeah, and I will say, Ken, that was, not to interject, but again, one of the benefits of that particular conference is it gives us access to have those type of conversations. And I did have a really good conversation with a representative from NYSERDA about the funding and the incentive issue. They understand the limitations. I did offer to him, that we'd be happy to put a roundtable together where we can bring in some fleets of different sizes and from different areas of the state and maybe provide some ideas on how they can improve that financing, because it is a disincentive. You're absolutely right. We do have companies that are interested in making those moves, but they don't have access to the financing that's available. And one of the frustrating parts of it, and I think, Ken, you and I talked a little bit about this, and it was brought up by one of the individuals at the conference, is a lot of the financing is targeted towards what's called environmental justice areas. So these are typically poorer communities that are around highly industrialized zones. There's a lot of truck emissions and other emissions there. And so that's where they're really targeting this. They're looking at, building out the infrastructure first in those areas. The problem is these trucks are so expensive that even with the incentives that are provided by NYSERDA, I'm not sure in those areas who can afford them. So one of the disconnects we have is we have areas that we want to go green and trucks that want to go green, and they're not focusing the infrastructure build out in those areas. They're focusing very much in these urban environments where, while it makes the most sense to run these types of trucks there, it's probably also one of the areas where it's going to be harder to get those trucks running because of the expense associated with it. So these are some of the pieces that the state's got to figure out on, how they're going to do that and make it make sense.
Yeah, it's you mentioned the cost. What we've been seeing is 3 to 4 times the cost of a diesel. So it's not insignificant. And and the other thing, there's a weight penalty. So we've got a little bit of work to do there, but we're going to staff that conference. I was unfortunately not able to do this year. Last year, there's a lot of great conversations. We're looking forward to attending again next summer. Well, my question was, the DOT has asked for comments on national road speed for over-the-road trucks.
Yeah.
I know the ATA has their position on it, but TANY also has theirs. And although same federation, that's not always the same. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. So I mentioned on the front end that we work very closely with our federal partners at the American Trucking Association. And normally we're in line with the positions, but this is certainly an example of where we're not. And even though we're technically a state affiliate of ATA, we still have the ability to take our own positions on issues. We do not always have to be in lockstep with the positions they take. So as it relates to road speed limiters, we're not in favor of them. Now, ATA has a policy, and don't quote me on the specifics of it, but they basically have certain parameters with their policy where they say, okay, if you meet A, B, C, D, and E, then we can get behind a speed limiter regulation. TANY does not have that policy. We're basically at this point just opposed to any concept of speed regulation. For a variety of reasons. We do think there are some safety concerns. I know every single one of us has got behind 2 trucks that are going maybe about a mile or 2 mile per hour difference, and the amount of aggravation that can cause people in the road rage it can cause is a challenge. Obviously, if you have slower trucks and you have passenger vehicles traveling at 10, 15, 20 miles per hour faster than those vehicles, that's a safety concern. Just different environmental issues, geography, going up mountains, down mountains, technology. There's so many reasons why we just feel this is a bad idea. There's better ways to improve safety on our highway than basically limiting the speed that a tractor trailer can go when we're not also limiting the speed of passenger vehicles. We know that trucks are not the primary cause of crashes. There's been studies done that 3/4 of crashes are typically caused by a passenger vehicle. Oftentimes it's because they're in the blind spot of the truck. So these are things that need to be addressed before you just say we're going to limit the speed of trucks and think that that's going to solve our crashes on our highways. So we've been opposed to it for a long time. We remain opposed to it. when the official comment period comes out on that, we will submit comments opposing it. What they've done thus far is they just asked for feedback. So it wasn't necessarily on a reg. They had a series of questions they were asking. And then I think the answers to those questions, they're going to use that to formulate a new rulemaking on this issue.
I wholeheartedly agree there with you, Kendra. I know my daughters just got, two of them got their driver's license, and of course they know I drive trucks for a living, and they always explain to me how intimidating trucks are to them on the highway. I'm sure that is one of those questions that are out on that table, and they discuss speed. And of course we're past that era of time where they had changed the speed limits just for the simple fact of being a fuel saving mechanism. So again, a whole host of other issues that I'm sure are still on the table.
Yep.
And I'll put a plug in for your daughter's sake. I'm Dwayne, the American Trucking Association, and TANY also participates, and it has a program called Share the Road, which helps new drivers especially, but all drivers in general, understand what it's like to interact with a large truck on the interstate. So that's a good thing. But yeah, as Leonard's perspective, we have a speed limit for our company, and we put that in place because we felt that's what was right for us. And I think that allowing individual companies to make that decision on their own, is the right choice. And and I think that's really what's driven the discussions at TANY is the companies doing what's right for them rather than one size fits all. But yeah, that's one of the few areas that we don't align with the national organization. So that's all right.
Yep. Yeah. And I think, Ken, that, the one size fits all is a recurring theme in terms of what we push back against, right? Because this industry is so diverse. There's so many different segments. There's so many different needs in terms of the operational characteristics of your vehicles that it is really difficult to write a single regulation that can address whatever the issue is that they're trying to get to without having some sort of negative impact on one segment of the industry. So it's a very difficult situation in terms of the speed limit. That's a great example of it, because some of these trucks, and certainly, to be clear, we're not advocating trucks speeding down the highway by any stretch, but there has to be the ability to have some control when it's needed as to how fast or how slow that vehicle is going.
Right. Well, Kendra, we certainly appreciate you being with us here today. Could you share some more information on how people in New York, if they wanted to reach out to TANY or get involved or join, can you share some contact information?
Yep, absolutely. Our website has a lot of great information on there about the organization and what we do, events that are coming up, and there is the ability to join the association right on the website. That's www.nytrucks.org. And certainly you can always call us at the office. We actually answer the phone with a live person. As a membership,
I'll vouch for that.
Yes. I hold strong as a membership-based organization. If you're calling us, we're answering the phone. You're not going to get an auto attendant. But you can give us a call at 518-458-9696. Any questions you have, if there's anything about rules or regs, anything that's come up as a result of something you heard today, we're certainly happy to have those conversations with you.
Great.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Your work to educate and advocate for the trucking industry is so important. We're grateful for everything that you're doing.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Great.
Well, that's a wrap for this edition of Leading the Way at Leonard's. If you have any questions or feedback, we'd love to hear from you at leadingtheway@leonardsexpress.com. That's leading the way, all one word, at leonardsexpress.com. And please don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe to the podcast. I'm your host, Dwayne Knepper. Until next time, keep on trucking.
We're running 18 wheels down that open highway. We drive on through the night so you can have it your way. With the angels of the highway, bringing hope across this land. Success yes.